Hi guys, welcome back to another tutorial. Today I'll be showing you how to paint grass using gouache paint. This was a highly requested video, so here it is, and I will be showing you how to do this in real time so you can follow along with me as I walk you through every step of the process. So to start off here, I have my Canon watercolor paper. I've got my palette, my 2 jars of water, and something just to dry my brushes off on. I'm just using an old cloth. And so what I've already done here on the paper is I have just lightly sketched out the scene. So here I've just put in the halfway line because that is roughly where the grass goes up to, and I've just put in a bit of the tree line. So I'll link the reference image in the description box so you can refer to that. Now we're only going to be painting the grass in today, so I'll just be leaving the clouds out of the painting. So we're just going to focus on the grass. And here on my palette I have primary blue, black and permanent green middle, and I've also got white. So here I have my 3/4 inch flat brush, and I'm going to use this to start to paint in the sky. So I usually like to start just by soaking my brush through, and then I will just dry it off. But I like to make sure that it is fully soaked through before I start working with it. So now for the sky, we're just going to use the primary blue and mix it with white. So because I've already wet my brush through before starting, when I start to pick up the paint, it already makes it buttery because the water on the brush already helps to dilute the paint out a little bit, so it's more of a buttery texture. And then I just adjust the water as I need to. So if I feel like my paint isn't spreading enough, then I will pick up a little bit more water, but I'll also make sure to pick up some more paint. So by doing that, I'm making sure that the paint that I'm putting on the paper isn't too thin. I don't want to dilute it out with too much water, otherwise it'll be a really thin wash, which means I'll usually have to go in with a second layer. But for this part, we can just do one layer if the paint is the right consistency. So as I'm moving down, I am just adding more white to the mixture as we are transitioning to a lighter blue. So I'm just going to keep adding white. And I'm going to need to dip my paintbrush in a bit more water as well. And so I'll just keep moving downwards like this. So here you can see that I am mostly just picking up the white paint now, because I will want to blend this out with the blue above it. So I don't want to pick up any more blue paint. I'm just picking up the white paint and using what's remaining on my brush to lay this color in, and then I will slowly move upwards and just blend it out, and that's how I can get a nice smooth blend in the sky. So that's all we're really going to do for the sky. We're just going to keep it nice and simple, and now we can start working on the grass. So I'm going to wash off my brush. And for the grass, what I like to do is always lay down the base color first. So when I'm looking at the reference image, I can see that the base color is black or a very dark green. So I'm going to start with that. So I'm going to use the same brush, and I'm just going to pick up mostly black paint, but I just want to add a little bit of the green into it. So it's a very, very dark green mixture. And once I have that, then I'm going to just block out this whole area, including where the trees and bushes are. So if your paint is not spreading, just add a little bit more water to it. and just keep going. So I can keep adding water because I have a lot of paint here. If you're only using a bit of paint and you add too much water, it's going to over dilute it. So make sure you are compensating with adding enough paint as well while you are adding the water. And if you can see these other bits of paint on my palette, that's because I just washed off this palette, but I like to keep these little bits on here because I will usually just reactivate it and use it if I need to. So that way I'm not wasting paint. I only wash off the paint that I no longer want, but if I still have some paint left over from the last session, I'll usually just leave it on the palette and keep working with it. So in this part, you just need to block in the whole area. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I also got some better audio recording equipment, so hopefully the audio on this tutorial is better than the last real-time tutorial. I have a little microphone clipped to me, so I'm hoping that it's picking up less of the echo in the room this time. Okay, so that's all we're really going to do for the base layer. It doesn't have to be perfect, we just need to lay down a base color first. So now I can wash off this brush and switch to a round brush. Okay, so now I am switching to a round brush. This is my Princeton Neptune round brush in size 6. And to start, I'm just going to, again, soak it in the water. And just dry it off slightly. And then we actually do want to wait for this background layer to dry first. So I can see it's about 80% dried. So we're going to wait for it to dry before we start with the next layer. Otherwise, if you try to work on it while it's still wet, then your colors will start to muddy. And because what we're trying to do is we're trying to lay lighter colors on top here. So if the layer below here is still wet, then if we're trying to lay on more lighter colors, it'll be hard for the light colors to be vibrant. So we're going to wait for it to dry. And in the meantime, we can start thinking about what color we want to start with. We're going to use the same mixture as before, but I'm just going to add a bit of yellow here as well because we will need to add that in later to make some brighter greens. And so to start off, I'm going to mix the same thing, but I want it to be a little bit lighter than the first layer we just laid down. So I'm going to add a bit more green to it. And the next thing we want to think about is where is the light source coming from. So from the image, I can see the light source is coming somewhere from the right hand side. So we just need to keep that in mind as we start adding in the highlights, because we want to leave the left side more in shadow and we highlight on the right side. So I'm going to start over here and I'm going to start doing this stippling motion where I am painting in the shape of the bushes here. And you can see my paint is quite dark. It's a very dark green color. So we're just going to do the same thing across the rest of the tree line here. We're just going to start putting in the shape of the trees. And we're going to do that by just using the same stippling motion. And this is just the first layer of the highlights. I will probably go in with another 2 layers, maybe even 3 if I want brighter highlights. So now that we've put in the tree line, we are going to start highlighting. And again, we're using the same mixture as before, but we want it to just be a little bit lighter. So just add in maybe a little bit more green to the mixture. And what we're going to do is start to highlight the right side of all these trees. So again, starting on this side, I'm just going to add in some highlights here. So I'm really just carving out the shape. In the first layer, it is hard to see the highlights, but as you build it up, you'll start to see where it is. And it is especially hard to see it show up on the camera, but I can see in front of me that where I'm putting in these little highlights, I can see that those areas are lighter. So we just want to bring this down to about here. And that's where the grass line starts. So just have this sort of line in mind. You can just see it in your head, or you can sort of paint it out in front of you so you can see where you need to paint up to. For me, I am constantly looking up at the reference image, which I have just in front of me, and I'm constantly looking at it to judge where I need to paint. So as I said before, this is just the first layer of the highlights. After we do this, we're going to lighten the paint further. So we're going to add in maybe a bit of yellow and add more green and build on top of what we are currently highlighting. And that's how you create depth in these paintings, by building it up in layers. So now that we've finished the first layer, we're going to start with the second layer. And one thing you want to make sure of again is this layer has to be dry before you start with the next layer. But because this process does take a little bit of time, by the time you finish this side is probably already dry, so you can start with the next layer already. So for the next layer, I'm going to add a bit of yellow into the mixture so that I can lighten the green and make it a little bit more bright. But I'm also adding in a little bit of black because black and yellow makes olive green, and I can see that the color in the reference is not all that bright, it's more of an olive green. So here is the color I'm happy with, and I'm going to start doing the same thing as before, but I'm going to be more selective with which areas I'm going to highlight. So again, I'm highlighting more on the right side of these trees. So in this step, you're really carving out the shape of these trees, because wherever you choose to highlight is however the tree will take shape. So make sure you are very selective with which areas you choose to highlight, because this will determine the shape of these trees. And any areas that you don't highlight will mostly be left in shadow. And we are only highlighting in areas where we've previously laid down the other highlight color. If we didn't highlight it in the last step, then we don't want to do it in this step, because we want to leave those in shadow. So we finished the second layer of highlights, and for the third layer I am adding in a little bit of white and yellow to the mixture, because I want the highlight to be even brighter. And again, we are going to be even more selective with what we are highlighting this time round. So now we've finished with the tree line. I'm happy with how it looks and I'm going to move on to painting the grass. So we're actually going to follow the same process as we just did, except this time we'll be painting in grass. So again, we're going to start with a color that is just slightly lighter than this base color here. So I'm going to use the same green and black mixture. And I'm going to just start putting in these strands of grass like this. And again, this first layer is probably hard for you to see on camera where the strands of grass are, but I can see in front of me where I'm laying it. So I'm just going to keep repeating this action where I'm just quickly putting in all these little strokes. So the rest of the process will pretty much be like this. It is quite repetitive, but once you build up the layers, it's really fun to see it all come together. And remember, some of these strands can come up and cover the tree line. So what I might do is I might work in strips. So I'll work in this section first, then I'll move down to this section and then the front section. So if I'm just working on this section here, then I've laid in the first layer of highlight, so I'm going to start putting in the second layer, and to do that I'm going to lighten my paint mixture. By adding in a little bit of yellow, and I'm going to start highlighting a bit of the tops of these strands of grass. So you don't want to highlight the whole thing, you just want to highlight towards more of the tip, and then when we add in the third layer of highlights, then we'll highlight again even higher up each strand of grass. And you can be quite loose with your brush strokes here because some of these grass strands are really tall. So you can be really loose with the way you paint them on, and you just use your wrist to just sort of flick them on like this. Now I'm going to go in with the third layer and I'm adding more white to my mixture. And this time I am highlighting more of the tips of these grass strands. So now this layer, you can see that the highlight is a lot more obvious, so you want to be careful, you want to be more selective with where you place them. You don't want to highlight everything, otherwise it won't look real and it won't look three-dimensional. You want to make sure you're only highlighting towards the tips of the grass. And just make sure that they're all different. You don't want them to be exactly uniform. You want some to be taller, some to be shorter, and you want them sort of swaying in different directions as well. So I'll leave that as it is. I don't want to overdo this, and then I'm going to move on to the next section, and maybe once I build up everything I can come back and see if I need to fix up anything. So let's repeat the process with the second layer. So I'm using this dark green mixture again to start to put in a second layer of the grass. So you want to leave a bit of a gap between here and here because you want this part to be darker. So we'll just leave that part as it is, and we'll just start putting in the grass below it here. And if you look at the image, you'll see that the grass isn't exactly in these perfect kind of rows. So when you're painting, just make sure that you make it a bit more random so it looks a bit more natural. So I'm kind of just focusing on this middle area here. And now I'm going to again lighten my mixture with a bit more yellow. And just start to put in some of these highlights. And again, for the brightest highlights, I'm going to add in a bit of white and a bit more yellow. and just really start to put in some of these really bright highlights at the tops. Okay, I'm going to leave this layer as it is and again move on to this layer here, so the front area. So I'm going to start with the darker color first. So I pretty much use this same technique for every kind of painting where there is grass. So if you can understand how to apply this concept, then you can pretty much paint any kind of landscape with grass in it, because it's just about building up layers. So if you know how to lay in the base layer and then you know how to build up the layers, then that's really all there is to painting grass. And the realism comes from being able to paint really thin strokes. This is just the style that I like to paint in, but there are also different styles that you can experiment in, so you don't necessarily have to paint it exactly the way I do. I think the way I paint things, it takes maybe a little bit more time because I am painting in each individual stroke of grass, whereas in other styles maybe you paint in a block and then you highlight them rather than painting in every single stroke. But so far this is just kind of the style that I naturally paint in, so this is just my approach to how I paint grass. Alright, so for the last layer, I'm going to repeat the same process where I lighten my paint with some more yellow and start to highlight it. So with the grass in the foreground, you want to be quite loose with the way you paint them in. The more kind of loose they are, the more it looks like they are swaying in the wind, which is the kind of look we are trying to go for. And in terms of the consistency of the paint that I'm working with, you want to make sure that your paint is just wet enough so that it will flow across the page. So you can see that every time I'm laying on these brush strokes, the paint just easily comes off the brush and it's not streaky or anything. But what you don't want is you don't want it to be too wet where it's very watered down and very thin. So you want to get the consistency just right so that it easily comes off the brush without being streaky, but it's not too wet in that it's a very sheer layer. Alright, now I'm going to go in with the final highlights. So I'm adding in a lot of white and some yellow. Okay, so now at this stage of the process, I'm going to zoom out and just take a look at what I've painted so far because I don't want to overdo the highlights. So I think I've put in enough highlights here. And what I want to do is just sort of observe and see if this is kind of what I'm going for and where I can add in a bit more detail so it doesn't look so uniform. So I think I'm going to put in a few more really bright highlights, but I'm going to be really selective about it. So I'm going to use white paint and just be really selective about where I put in a few of these really bright highlights. Because I don't want to put these everywhere, otherwise it'll just overthrow the painting and it just won't look as realistic. And after we put in these bright highlights, then we can go ahead and put in the little flowers that are also in this picture. Right, so as I said before, I don't want to overdo this, so I'm going to leave this as it is. But what I might do is just add in a bit more darker grass down here because I feel like it's a little bit lacking. So I'm going to add in some dark green grass just around the bottom. This is just from me observing my own painting and just feeling like it's a little bit lacking down here. So I'm just going to add in a bit more. And you can also use this time to just take a look at your own painting and see which areas you might want to fix up a little bit. So I'm going to leave that as it is, and now to add in the flowers, we're just going to use yellow paint and white. So we're going to use a light yellow and for the far away ones we can just sort of dot it in. So from the image it looks like they're just in these little clusters, so I'm just going to paint in these little clusters of flowers, and I'm just making sure that these dots are really small because these flowers are really far away, so they should be a lot smaller. And as you move down, they can start to gradually get bigger. So that's the first layer for the flowers. Now I'm actually going to go in with a second layer because I feel like the yellow isn't quite bright enough. It's a little bit hard for it to be bright on top of the green underneath. So I'm just going to go in with a second layer and just sort of go over some of them where I feel like it's not quite bright enough. So especially with these bigger flowers up the front, I can see the paint is a little bit sheer. It's not as bright and vibrant as I'd like it to be. So I'm just going to go in with a second layer just to try and brighten it up a bit more. And you can add a little bit more white to your mixture so the yellow is brighter. And then I'm just going to look at my painting and I think it is pretty much done. I might just add in a few more details here and there. And that is all for the grass tutorial today. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it and that you found it helpful. If you have a go at this painting, do tag me on Instagram because I would love to see it. Thank you guys so much for watching and I hope you have a lovely day. See you in the next video. Bye bye.